is, the hardware starts to multiply.
Correct.
Like a hydra at every network zone, you need to tap things. And I think, using Garland, I can see is a very efficient way to go, right, we're going to collect all these spans, and instead of having to run all this cabling and put,
NetSeg or bust, keep your network zero trust. NetSeg.io, where the data needs to go.
All right, welcome to the first episode of the NetSeg PoggCast or podcast.
So we're going.
Yeah, welcome. So we're welcoming Burt here from Garland. Ben, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and about Garland Technology?
Burt, Technical Director at Garland APJ. Garland Technology is a network visibility solution. We provide network taps, packet brokers, anything that's hardware driven to give visibility into those maybe hard to reach areas like OT, critical infrastructure, those sorts of things play to our strengths of our product set.
Yeah, brilliant. And one of the things I like about Garland is, a lot of technology vendors now seem to be really focused on how can we get as much money out of our customers? How can we do everything as a subscription? Yeah. And, when I met Chris Bahari a couple of years ago, I was really impressed at his attitude of look, we're focused on a specific use case. We don't need to try and milk our customers with subscriptions. Yep. We're going to focus, I think it's primarily you just buy the hardware and put it in and it just runs and it runs reliably. Yep. And they're solving a specific problem at what I think is a fair price point.
And I think that plays well to the market, right? In critical infrastructure or, those heavily segmented environments, you're not always got an internet connection where you can dial home and update a subscription or update a license, these sorts of things. And we understand some of our devices will be purchased, put into a basement somewhere and never see the light of day for 10 years.
Yep.
So we understand that as a business case and a use case for our customers. So therefore, we don't license our products that way. It doesn't make any sense to have those products turn off after 5 years if they're not got a license or an update. And our customers, are agreeing with us on that. We're seeing uptake off the back of a renewal or a subscription lapsing, these sorts of things. So that works very well.
Yeah, and I think it's a sign of success when you put something in an OT environment and it just works uninterrupted for a decade or longer.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, it's funny. We get a few people we meet at events. They'll come up and they go, "Oh, I've seen some of your green stuff in our racks somewhere." Like, all right, good.
That was the logo from 8 years ago.
Yeah, correct, exactly. So that's always nice to hear, and I think that business model does work really well for OT, and we want to do the right thing by the market. I don't think, we joked about it before, milking customers or really pushing to do that ARR and push up a share price or anything like that. We're in the market to do the right thing, build the right products to suit the customers, and it's a win-win for everyone.
Yeah, 100%. Now that's really good. Now I know that you do more than just OT cyber, but I think we'll probably keep it to OT cyber use cases today because this podcast is really about OT cybersecurity, industrial cybersecurity. So, some of the interesting problems being solved that Garland helps solve is doing things like one-way taps, spanning unmanaged switches. If you're going into a legacy environment with unmanaged switches, how do you get visibility of what's happening? Simplifying the data collection if you've got a lot of disparate things you need to collect data from. Can you share a bit about some of those use cases that you're seeing?
Yeah, so one-way data diode, we do see a lot of questions about that at the moment, especially with SOCI and similar compliance throughout the region. It is about maintaining an air gap. Some people don't like the word air gap. I know
guilty as charged.
But it is about maintaining that that enclosed environment that's impenetrable, right? So a hardware data diode is a really good way of getting that data out without breaking that air gap.
Yeah.
While also, some people go, I could put a firewall and could do a similar thing. But the difference is that a firewall, there's a policy, it can be manipulated. Every threat under the sun or every cyber attack under the sun, it's been the event of someone having an any rule at the bottom, right?
Yep.
So a hardware data diode, it's like a light switch. It only goes one way. It doesn't do anything else. It's there to provide that one function. So that's something we've seen a lot of success in.
Yep. So you're isolating the network with actual physics versus a
correct
policy rule based.
Exactly right. And with that policy, obviously comes compliance and auditing and those sorts of things. So you're adding overhead. Whereas with this hardware data diode, you know, without word of a lie, that traffic will only ever go one way.
Yep. Yeah, terrific. Okay, so what about if it's an environment where, okay, it's a legacy environment, they're going to keep sweating that asset for the next 20 years. We want visibility on what's happening, maybe to meet SOC obligations, but it's all unmanaged switches. Do we need to do a whole switch upgrade just to do threat detection in that environment? How do you solve that problem?
Yeah, so network taps are a really good use case for that. They are, you know, you've got to pick your battles. Some people don't like network taps because you've got to take down the network.
Yeah.
Realistically, it's like replacing an Ethernet cable. It's a minute or two of downtime, and then you get full visibility for the life of the solution.
So you're connecting in series
Correct.
with what was an unmanaged switch where you
Yeah,
wouldn't
exactly.
span.
So what you would do is generally pick an item of interest and say, I want to monitor that device.
Yeah.
So it might be a HMI because you know that is doing all the inputs and outputs and controls to a lower level of an environment, or it might be an RTU, which is doing the, you know, receiving inputs from their HMI and then sending those commands out through the rest of the network. So if you pick your battles and choose where you want to place these things, you can get really good bang for buck. We've seen customers put one tap and that does 90% of their environment.
Yep.
So that works really well for them. And we've seen other environments where it might be a series or a suite of taps covering the environment to get that visibility. And an unmanaged switch is a really good way or a really good use case for us in that, you know, spam ports are great. You know, we don't, you know, they do have their place in the market. There is a place where they need to be used. But spam was never designed as a it was designed as a troubleshooting solution. It was never a long-term monitoring thing.
Yeah.
So having dedicated hardware to do that function definitely has benefits. You know, less drop packets, less user error, less, you know, all these things that can go wrong with a spam port. Even saw a customer this week, spam port you can inject traffic back into. So they were doing some testing and we looped a network. They had broadcast going back into the network and took the switch offline.
Yeah, right.
So some of these lower spec OT environments, they don't have protections that newer IT infrastructure has to protect those span ports.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's definitely a use case. And SOCI comes into that. You know, even on a span port, you need to have a data diode. You need to have some protection there to stop something being injected back into that network and breaking that air gap. So
you're seeing a lot of interest from customers in Australia, and for those who aren't in Australia, SOCI Act is the local Australian regulation for critical infrastructure cybersecurity. So when people are coming to you to sort of help address their SOCI requirements, what does that look like? Where does Garland come into that?
Yeah, so, you know, these guys, the teams that deal with SOCI are very well versed in what's going on. We are there simply to solve one or two use cases, so we don't normally have a big visibility, a lot of visibility of the larger overall solution, but it is generally a CPS vendor going in there, getting that visibility into that platform. The CPS vendors, their sensors generally can't go lower in that Purdue model.
Yep.
So it might be something sitting at level 3.
Yep.
You know. So having a network tap or a data diode or some kind of span aggregator collecting that traffic at a level 1, level 2, and feeding that data back up, that's where our bread and butter, that's where we play.
Yeah, and look, I've seen a lot of environments where people have deployed, you know, as you said, a CPS vendor that's doing like OT network visibility. And a lot of the time, they're tapping a core switch at level 3. They've got a level of visibility, but they don't have visibility of like the east-west traffic flows down in sort of that level 0 to 2 Purdue. And, you know, I think one of the challenges with doing threat detection and physical sensors in environments is, you know, the hardware starts to multiply. You know, like a Hydra, at every network zone you need to tap things. And I think, you know, using Garland I can see is a very efficient way to go, right, we're going to collect all these spans, and instead of having to run all this cabling and put, you know, 20 network sensors at this location, we can just bring that out into like one gig aggregation point and just tap that straight into whichever appliance we're putting it, you know, level 3 or 3.5,
Correct.
ITO to DMZ, and that gives us all the network traffic spans. We can see all the VLANs, see what's happening from a threat detection.
And that's a really good point. You know, a lot of times we are an afterthought. You know, people put in a CPS vendor and go, hey, you know, this is great. We're meeting all our compliance standards. And then they realise, oh, we've got a lot of blind spots over here and over here. So we're sometimes an afterthought where we come through to, hey, we need visibility this environment. Which obviously not ideal way of doing it. There is a few out there that are really have these strong visibility fabrics or these visibility architectures where everything's out of band. They know what they need to see, and then it becomes a point of filtering what data you want to see. Maybe you have got a CPS that you need to send your OT data to. You might have a SIEM or long-term packet capture that you want to send other data to. So having these devices that can either aggregate or regenerate traffic flows in a low footprint and small form factor, makes a lot of sense. So.
Yeah, that's right. And look, I think one of the interesting things I'm seeing with some of the projects I'm working on, NetSeg aren't a reseller, so we're not like going and finding opportunities where we can sell some Garland equipment to a customer. But when we're speccing CPS visibility and even if they maybe have something that can see level 3, but we're trying to get more comprehensive visibility to meet their requirements, then it makes sense to spec Garland versus putting in a whole lot of new appliances, finding rack space, doing cabling. Well, guess what? We can do these spans or network taps if it's unmanaged switches, and get that visibility in a really efficient way. And that turns a 12-month project into 2-3 months.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that lower level of the Purdue model works well for us in that we've got products that suit that market. They might be DIN rail mounted, they might be DC powered. Any mix or match of fibre, copper, SFPs, those sorts of things. So because we've got such a broad product set, we really have products that suit that customer corner use case or what have you. So I think that really works well to our strengths in those unique environments or even that, that critical infrastructure or harsher environments. So.
Yeah, that's right. And, the other thing I like is it doesn't have to be a whole separate project. You've got to stand up all this money. It's like, okay, well, this is basically just enhancement to maybe a bit of cabling work we're doing.
Yeah, correct.
We're going to add these other appliances in and it's going to do that.
And I think, unfortunately, our market or our, Garland's product set has worked well to kind of dispel some rumours in the market or some mistruths in the market. Sometimes people think traffic visibility, I need this massive packet broker that needs to do all of these features. And that's not always the case. Sometimes you could use a tap that can do regeneration will solve that use case. So I think, there are cost savings to go down that path and look at those different deployment methodologies, whereas sometimes those architectures are dismissed because they're deemed to be expensive, where that's simply not the case in a lot of times.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful point you've touched on, Ben, that it's really easy. I've seen like the whole range of different kinds of hardware form factors you offer. Like it's really easy, I think, to right size something that's very targeted to solve a specific problem and address that really quickly and efficiently, especially in OT environments where sometimes rack space might be at a premium.
Exactly.
Or it's maybe a harsher environment, you need something more rugged.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Oh, brilliant. Yeah, look, I think one of the interesting things I've seen evolve over the last couple of years with CPS visibility and like cybersecurity visibility in OT environments is that it used to just be pure passive network visibility. And then when you need to get more asset-centric visibility, you're limited to what's on the wire when you're doing that method. And so a lot of asset visibility methods I've seen now is moving towards more like asset interrogation type methods. Either it's like passive project files or like actively scanning devices in their own factory protocols. But you still need to see what's happening on the wire to do the threat detection. And one of the key exposures scenarios that I'm talking to a lot of clients and people I work with about is about, okay, well, we kind of start to get a handle on what the vulnerabilities are of these assets and things, but exposures like that external connectivity. Do we know all the data is going out through an IT/OT DMZ? If the strategy is to air gap, a term I do not like, but to semi-isolate an environment, how do we validate that integrity? And the only way you can do it is by seeing what's communicating on the wire, so that you can detect and respond to those incidents. And another good data point is what we've seen publicly reported in the US with Volt Typhoon. Living off the LAN techniques, you're not going to detect those unless you have network visibility and probably down to the lower levels of the Purdue model.
Our founder loves to say the truth is in the packets. If you're right, if you don't have that visibility, you don't have that lower level inspection, you don't know what's going on in those environments. And the problem is, or an issue with some of these older deployments, especially in OT, they're not always IP-based networks. They talk some really strange protocols. Sometimes they're custom protocols written by the vendors to get a solution built, and these assets are still being sweated 30 years later. Sometimes it's not as simple as putting in a firewall and you can protect everything and see everything. And also, because these environments were built 30 years ago, they're built with X amount of capacity in spec. You add active scanning, you add these other things, they can cause delay, introduce extra latency in the network, and that can sometimes be an issue. So I think really the first step of anywhere is get visibility. That the truth is in the packets. You need to see that packet level visibility. Then you can make assessments on, okay, is this an asset that I need active scanning on? Is this a device that I need to put a firewall in place? I think OT will eventually get an uplift and move to a more, more capable in terms of their what they can do in those environments. They can't always do that active scanning. They can't always do, IP-based communication. That'll change. Those assets will be life-cycled. There'll be newer technologies involved in those environments, and that'll give you the capability to give those extra visibility pieces. But that, you need to start somewhere, right? You need to get in there and get that visibility piece as an entry point into securing the rest of the environment.
Yeah, and as we both know, the technology refresh cycle in OT is very different to a data center, and
Correct.
30, 40 years is not uncommon for there still to be infrastructure running.
Absolutely. Back in the old days, at some other vendors, if you had a device that was 15 years on the network, you'd be seriously sweating. That device is still there and still operational. Whereas that's not uncommon in OT.
100%. So I guess to round things out, Ben, and to conclude, really helpful way to get the visibility you need without having to totally re-architect a network, refresh the infrastructure, often not possible. Right size solutions without having to do a whole big packet broker network visibility project. You can kind of focus on those point use cases where you need something specific. So for any cyber leaders listening who maybe struggle with that network visibility, how should they know, I need to have a chat to Garland about how the problems I can solve?
I think if you've got a SOC project in flight, or you're not getting the TCO you expected out of your CPS vendor, that's always a good entry point. But have a discussion. There are lots of different vendors in the market. Different vendors play their operations different. There's don't ever feel because a product was out of scope and expensive that they're the only vendor you can deal with. There's other vendors out there who may be able to offer. The way we like to say it is right sized for your use case. It doesn't need to be this massive big packet broker with 48 ports and subscriptions and renewals and all those sorts of things. It could be a 4-port device, it could be a 10-port device. So, don't be afraid to have a discussion and reach out to vendors. Not everyone's, not everyone's that super aggressive sales market where they're trying to kick down the door and get the renewal every year. We're about doing the right thing by the market and selling a solution that's suitable for both parties.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, you just made me think of a project I'm quoting at the moment, which is a 62443 redesign, which includes a discovery process. And I think as part of that, there's going to be some level of visibility, not just to do discovery, but continuously, validating the integrity of those network segmentation controls. And that's probably one of the other things where there's not really anything in it from for NetSeg in terms of we're not interested in selling products, but being able to see those problems and use our expertise to go, right, this is a solution where we need to bring Garland in and engage you to spec, okay, how are we going to solve this problem? This is the hardware we need, it's right sized. It might only be a couple of $1,000s, but bang, we've compressed a timeline by another 2 months and we don't need extra rack space, we don't have to worry about extra power, and all of a sudden we've significantly enhanced our visibility.
We've been used regularly to accelerate a proof of concept, those sorts of things for some of those vendors, so 100%.
So look, Ben, thanks very much for being on the podcast. Appreciate it. And
appreciate your time.
Yeah, very excited to see what Garland's got in store and the other successes you have with your customers.
Awesome. Thanks, Liam. Appreciate the
worries.
opportunity.
NetSeg or bust.